The ballroom shimmered under the glow of elaborate chandeliers, their crystals refracting light like a million tiny diamonds. Waitstaff in crisp uniforms moved deftly through the crowd, balancing trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres as laughter and the hum of conversations filled the air. Robert Manning, a prominent executive and the evening's host, stood near the grand staircase, basking in the accolades of his peers. This event was his triumph, celebrating another year of his company's success. Robert thrived on admiration, his ego fed by the subtle envy and overt praise of those around him. His tailored suit and sharp features exuded wealth and power, but beneath his polished exterior was a man who craved control in every interaction. As he surveyed the crowd, Robert spotted a figure that pulled at a forgotten corner of his mind. Eleanor, his ex-wife, stood near the back of the room, speaking softly to a couple near the buffet. Her understated elegance set her apart from the opulence around her. She wore a simple navy dress, her hair swept back in a style that highlighted her quiet confidence. While others adorned themselves with jewels and designer labels, Eleanor's presence was marked by her authenticity. It was this contrast that drew eyes to her, including Robert's, who felt a pang of annoyance as he recalled their shared history. Their marriage had ended years ago, not with explosive fights but with the quiet erosion of respect. Robert had always considered Eleanor's modest upbringing a blemish against his carefully curated life. She was intelligent and kind, but Robert had convinced himself that she lacked the sophistication required to complement his ambition. Now, seeing her standing composed and radiant, he felt the old disdain resurface. Yet there was something unfamiliar in her posture, an air of self-assuredness that hadn't been there before. Intrigued but unwilling to acknowledge it, Robert turned back to his circle of admirers. As the evening progressed, Robert found himself drifting closer to Eleanor, his curiosity mingled with a desire to assert his dominance. He overheard snippets of her conversation, catching her articulate insights on art and culture. To him, it was almost laughable, this attempt to mingle with the elite. How could someone with such humble beginnings aspire to belong in his world? Robert decided to take the opportunity to remind her of her place, weaving his way toward her under the pretense of polite conversation. "Eleanor," he said smoothly, his voice carrying the practiced charm that had won over countless associates, "I almost didn't recognize you. It's been a while, hasn't it?" Eleanor turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "Yes, Robert," she replied, her tone measured. "It has been a long time." Her calm demeanor unsettled him. He had expected her to be flustered or eager to please, but she met his gaze without hesitation. Robert felt an itch of irritation, though he maintained his polished smile. Around them, guests began to notice their interaction, and Robert seized the moment to perform for his audience. "I see you've kept things simple," he remarked, letting his gaze linger on her dress. "It's admirable how you stay true to your roots." The insult was subtle but cutting, designed to humiliate without drawing overt attention. Eleanor, however, didn't flinch. "Simplicity is often underestimated," she replied. Her voice carried no malice, but her words landed with precision. "It allows one to focus on what truly matters." Her composure only fueled Robert's need to assert control. He gestured broadly to the room, drawing others into their conversation. "Well, not everyone is suited for the complexities of a life like this. It takes a certain refinement, don't you think?" Laughter rippled through the small crowd that had gathered, though some shifted uncomfortably. Eleanor's silence in the face of his veiled insult spoke volumes, her dignity towering over his bluster. She gave a polite nod and excused herself, leaving Robert standing amidst his amused companions. He laughed along with them, masking the strange unease her departure left in its wake. For the first time in a long while, Robert felt a flicker of self-doubt, though he quickly brushed it aside, convincing himself that Eleanor's composure was an act. As the night wore on, Robert couldn't resist mentioning Eleanor during his toast. Raising his glass, he addressed the crowd with his characteristic flair. "Tonight, we celebrate not just success but the ability to rise above our humble beginnings," he began, his eyes briefly finding Eleanor in the crowd. "It's a reminder that not everyone can keep up with the pace of ambition. Some are simply left behind." His words were met with scattered chuckles, though a few guests exchanged uneasy glances. Eleanor, standing near the back of the room, felt the weight of his words but refused to let them pierce her resolve. She had anticipated Robert's need to grandstand and had prepared herself for the possibility of such an attack. Rather than reacting, she lifted her glass in acknowledgement, a small, enigmatic smile on her lips. This unexpected response silenced the murmurs around her, leaving Robert momentarily thrown off his rhythm. He quickly recovered, continuing his toast as if her quiet defiance hadn't unnerved him. When the applause subsided, Eleanor made her way to the exit, her presence leaving a lingering impact on those who had witnessed the exchange. Robert watched her leave, a mix of triumph and unease settling in his chest. As the evening wound down, the memory of her smile haunted him, though he couldn't understand why. For Eleanor, however, the night marked a turning point. She had endured Robert's worst and walked away stronger. Unbeknownst to either of them, this was only the beginning of a journey that would change both their lives forever. As Eleanor walked to her car, the cool night air wrapped around her, a stark contrast to the heated exchange inside. Her heels clicked against the pavement, each step grounding her resolve. She replayed Robert's words in her mind, not with bitterness but with clarity. The man who had once been her husband was unchanged, trapped in the same cycle of arrogance and control that had driven them apart. But tonight, she had felt no sting from his barbs. Instead, she felt a strange sense of freedom, as though she had finally shed the last vestiges of his shadow over her life. Driving home, Eleanor thought about the years since their divorce. It had been a struggle at first, adjusting to the abrupt change in her circumstances. Robert's wealth and connections had provided a cushion during their marriage, but Eleanor had never relied on them entirely. When she left, she took little with her, determined to carve out her own path. She had started with a modest job at a local nonprofit, earning just enough to make ends meet. It wasn't glamorous, but it gave her a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. The memory of those early days filled her with a quiet pride. She had grown in ways Robert could never understand, finding strength in her struggles and wisdom in her failures. As she pulled into her driveway, Eleanor felt a renewed determination. Tonight's encounter had been a reminder of how far she had come, and she vowed never to let someone like Robert define her worth again. The next morning, Eleanor sat at her small kitchen table, sipping coffee as sunlight streamed through the windows. Her home was modest but cozy, filled with books and photographs that reflected the life she had built. She opened her laptop, checking emails and reviewing her schedule for the week. Since leaving her job at the nonprofit, she had started her own consulting firm, working with organizations to improve their community outreach programs. It was a role that combined her passion for social impact with her growing expertise in business strategy. One email caught her attention. It was an invitation to speak at a conference on women's leadership organized by a prestigious foundation. The opportunity was both exciting and daunting, a sign that her work was gaining recognition beyond her usual circles. Eleanor hesitated for a moment, the old voice of self-doubt whispering in her mind. But then she thought of Robert's words from the night before and felt a surge of defiance. She would accept the invitation, not as a way to prove anything to him, but as a testament to herself and the journey she had undertaken. Eleanor hit reply, her fingers steady on the keyboard. "Thank you for the opportunity," she typed, her confidence growing with each word. "I would be honored to participate." With a deep breath, she clicked send, feeling the weight of her decision settle into something lighter, something hopeful. It was a small step, but it marked the beginning of a new chapter in her life. Meanwhile, Robert sat in his sprawling office, the morning sun glinting off the glass walls that offered a panoramic view of the city. Despite the grandeur around him, he felt restless, his thoughts circling back to the night before. Eleanor's composed exit had left him feeling strangely unsettled, though he couldn't quite articulate why. He dismissed the thought, focusing instead on the stack of reports his assistant had placed on his desk. Yet even as he worked, the unease lingered, a nagging reminder of something he didn't want to confront. His company, Manning Enterprises, was facing challenges he hadn't anticipated. A series of poor investments and internal disputes had begun to erode its once solid foundation. Robert had always prided himself on his ability to steer the company through turbulent waters, but this time, the storm felt different. There was talk among the board members of bringing in outside consultants, a suggestion that Robert bristled at. He saw it as a challenge to his authority, a crack in the facade of control he had spent years cultivating. The tension followed him into a meeting with his executive team, where discussions quickly turned heated. "We need to diversify our portfolio," one of the directors argued. "Our current strategy isn't sustainable." Robert clenched his jaw, his irritation bubbling to the surface. "I didn't build this company by playing it safe," he retorted. "We don't need to change our approach. We need to execute it better." The room fell silent, the weight of his words settling over the group. Yet behind their nods of agreement, Robert could sense their doubts, a reflection of the ones he refused to acknowledge in himself. That evening, Robert returned to his empty penthouse, the echoes of the day's meetings reverberating in his mind. He poured himself a drink, the amber liquid catching the light as he stared out at the city below. His thoughts drifted again to Eleanor, not as the target of his ridicule but as the woman she had appeared to be last night, self-assured, poised, and undeniably out of reach. For the first time, he wondered if he had underestimated her, not just at the party but throughout their entire marriage. The realization was uncomfortable, like a splinter lodged deep in his pride. He remembered the early days of their relationship, when her kindness and intelligence had drawn him to her. Back then, he had admired her resilience, her ability to find joy in simple things. But as his career took off, his admiration had turned to contempt, fueled by his belief that her modesty was a liability rather than a virtue. Now, years later, he couldn't ignore the possibility that he had been wrong. Robert set down his glass, a flicker of something unfamiliar stirring within him. It wasn't regret, not yet, but it was enough to make him pause. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to consider the idea that Eleanor's life might not have been diminished by his absence. In fact, it might have flourished. The conference invitation brought a whirlwind of preparation for Eleanor. She immersed herself in crafting a presentation that not only highlighted her professional achievements but also conveyed the values she had grown to cherish: resilience, authenticity, and the importance of community. Her workdays were filled with drafting slides, rehearsing speeches, and coordinating with event organizers. Yet, amidst the flurry, she found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this point. On the day of the conference, Eleanor stepped into the grand auditorium, her nerves eclipsed by determination. The room was filled with industry leaders, innovators, and aspiring professionals, all eager to absorb the wisdom of the speakers. As Eleanor took the stage, a hush fell over the audience. She began with a story not of triumph but of struggle, her departure from an unfulfilling marriage, her decision to rebuild her life, and the lessons she learned along the way. Her words were raw and honest, resonating deeply with the crowd. By the time she finished, the room erupted into applause. Eleanor felt a swell of pride, not for the accolades but for the impact she had made. Attendees approached her afterward, thanking her for her candor and sharing how her story had inspired them. Among the crowd was Jonathan Hayes, a charismatic CEO known for his philanthropic endeavors. He introduced himself with a warm smile and genuine admiration for her work. What began as a professional connection would soon blossom into something far more profound. Back at Manning Enterprises, the situation was deteriorating. Robert's refusal to adapt to the changing market had alienated several key partners, and whispers of dissent among the board were growing louder. Financial reports painted a grim picture, with declining profits and missed targets becoming the norm. Robert, however, refused to acknowledge the depth of the crisis, insisting that the company's challenges were temporary setbacks rather than systemic issues. His arrogance extended beyond the boardroom. At social events, where he once basked in admiration, he now faced veiled critiques and wary glances. Colleagues who had once sought his advice began to distance themselves, wary of being associated with his sinking reputation. Yet Robert remained defiant, convinced that his past successes were enough to weather any storm. It was this hubris that blinded him to the warning signs, setting the stage for an inevitable reckoning. One evening, as he sat alone in his office, Robert received an email from a former associate. The message was brief but pointed: "Change is inevitable, Robert. The question is, will you lead it or be swept away by it?" The words lingered in his mind, unsettling him in a way he couldn't shake. For the first time, he began to question whether his refusal to change was a sign of strength or a fatal flaw. Months after the conference, Eleanor attended a gala for a charitable foundation. The event was a gathering of the city's most influential figures, and she was invited as a guest speaker to share her experiences in philanthropy. She arrived with Jonathan by her side, their partnership having evolved into a deep and supportive relationship. They moved through the crowd with ease, their connection apparent in every glance and shared smile. Among the attendees was Robert, whose company had recently become a sponsor of the foundation in a bid to salvage its tarnished image. When he saw Eleanor across the room, his heart sank. She was radiant, exuding confidence and grace in a way that made her seem untouchable. Beside her, Jonathan exuded quiet authority, his reputation as a visionary leader preceding him. The contrast between Robert's unraveling life and Eleanor's ascent was stark, and it hit him with the force of a tidal wave. Determined to salvage some semblance of dignity, Robert approached her. "Eleanor," he said, his voice tinged with forced joviality, "it's been a while. You've certainly blossomed." Eleanor turned to face him, her expression polite but distant. "Hello, Robert," she replied, her tone neutral. "It has been a while." The exchange was brief, but it left Robert feeling smaller than he ever had before. He returned to his table, nursing his drink and his wounded pride, while Eleanor moved on, her laughter mingling with the hum of the crowd. As the gala wound down, Robert found himself lingering in the shadows, watching Eleanor and Jonathan as they mingled with the other guests. He couldn't help but compare the man he had been during their marriage to the person Jonathan appeared to be now, kind, attentive, and deeply respectful of Eleanor. The realization was a bitter pill to swallow. For years, Robert had told himself that Eleanor's departure was her loss, not his. But seeing her now, thriving in ways he had never imagined, forced him to confront a painful truth: he had been the one holding her back. Driving home that night, Robert's mind was a storm of memories and regrets. He thought of the ways he had belittled Eleanor, not just publicly but in the small, insidious ways that had eroded her confidence. He remembered the nights she had tried to share her dreams with him, only for him to dismiss them as unimportant. At the time, he had convinced himself that he was doing her a favor, shielding her from disappointment. Now, he saw his actions for what they were: acts of control, born out of his own insecurities. The weight of his realization was almost unbearable. For the first time in years, Robert allowed himself to feel the full extent of his regret. He didn't yet know what to do with it, but he knew one thing for certain: Eleanor's success had nothing to do with him. She had built her life in spite of him, not because of him. And that, more than anything, was a humbling revelation. In the weeks following the gala, Robert's life seemed to spiral further. His company was teetering on the edge of collapse, and the board of directors had grown increasingly vocal in their criticisms. A particularly tense meeting culminated in an ultimatum: either Robert agreed to bring in outside consultants, or the board would move to vote him out as CEO. Robert was livid. To him, this was the ultimate betrayal, a sign that the people he had trusted to stand by him were now ready to turn against him. Alone in his office that evening, Robert stared at the framed awards and photographs that lined his walls. They were relics of his glory days, reminders of a time when his authority had been unquestioned. But now, those accomplishments felt hollow, overshadowed by the mounting failures that threatened to define his legacy. For the first time, Robert considered the possibility that he might lose everything he had worked so hard to build. The thought terrified him. Yet, in the quiet of his office, another realization began to take root. Robert had always prided himself on being a self-made man, but his success had come at a cost: alienated colleagues, a broken marriage, and a trail of fractured relationships. He couldn't deny it any longer. The problem wasn't just the circumstances around him. The problem was him. Meanwhile, Eleanor's life continued to flourish. Her consulting firm had grown rapidly, attracting high-profile clients and earning her a reputation as one of the most innovative minds in her field. Jonathan had been an unwavering source of support, encouraging her to take risks and embrace her full potential. Together, they had become a powerhouse couple, admired not only for their professional achievements but also for their shared commitment to giving back to the community. One evening, Eleanor and Jonathan attended a charity auction benefiting underprivileged children. As they mingled with the other guests, Eleanor couldn't help but reflect on how far she had come. She remembered the days when she had struggled to make ends meet, her confidence worn thin by years of Robert's condescension. Those memories felt distant now, like shadows from another life. She had rebuilt herself piece by piece, not just surviving but thriving. During the event, Eleanor was approached by a young woman who introduced herself as an aspiring entrepreneur. "I've followed your work for years," the woman said, her voice trembling with excitement. "Your story inspires me. It gives me hope that I can build something meaningful, too." Eleanor was deeply moved. It was moments like these that reminded her why she had chosen this path: to create not just a successful career but a legacy of empowerment and impact. Robert's reckoning began in earnest when a close colleague, someone he had once mentored, approached him with an unexpected proposition. "Robert," the man said, "you've always been a brilliant strategist, but it's clear you've hit a wall. I want to help you turn this around." The offer was humbling, a reminder that even in his lowest moments, there were still people willing to extend a hand. But it came with a condition: Robert would need to relinquish some control and allow others to guide him. For Robert, this was an almost insurmountable challenge. He had spent his entire career equating leadership with dominance, convinced that showing vulnerability was a sign of weakness. Yet, as he looked at the mounting evidence of his failures, he knew he had no choice. Swallowing his pride, he agreed to the terms, marking the first step in what would become a long and painful journey towards self-awareness. The process was grueling. Robert was forced to confront uncomfortable truths about himself, the arrogance that had driven away allies, the rigidity that had stifled innovation, and the fear of failure that had led him to push others down to elevate himself. It wasn't easy, but slowly, he began to change. He started listening more, delegating responsibilities, and seeking feedback from his team. For the first time in years, Robert felt a flicker of hope, not just for his company but for himself. One crisp autumn afternoon, Eleanor found herself at a coffee shop downtown, reviewing notes for an upcoming project. The warm aroma of roasted beans filled the air, blending with the soft hum of conversation around her. She was focused, her pen moving swiftly across the page, when a familiar voice broke through her concentration. "Eleanor?" She looked up to see Robert standing a few feet away, his expression a mixture of surprise and hesitation. He looked different, his usually impeccable suit was slightly rumpled, and there was a weariness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. For a moment, Eleanor considered brushing him off, retreating behind the walls she had built to protect herself. But something in his demeanor gave her pause. "Robert," she said, her tone neutral. "What brings you here?" He hesitated, as if weighing his words. "I've been thinking about everything," he said finally. "About us, about how I treated you, and how wrong I was. I don't expect forgiveness, but I needed to say it, to admit that I failed you in ways I'm only now beginning to understand." His voice wavered, the vulnerability in his words catching Eleanor off guard. She studied him for a moment, searching for sincerity in his eyes. What she saw surprised her, not the arrogance she had come to associate with him, but a glimmer of genuine regret. "It takes courage to admit when you've been wrong," she said softly. "I hope you've found a way to learn from it." With that, she turned back to her notes, leaving Robert to process her words. Robert left the coffee shop with Eleanor's words echoing in his mind. "It takes courage to admit when you've been wrong." The phrase felt like both an indictment and an invitation, a challenge to confront his shortcomings head-on. For the first time, Robert didn't feel defensive in the face of criticism. Instead, he felt a strange sense of clarity, as though a weight he hadn't even realized he was carrying had begun to lift. Back at his office, Robert began making changes. He started by meeting individually with his employees, many of whom had grown distant under his leadership. These conversations were uncomfortable at first, filled with awkward pauses and halting attempts at vulnerability. But as Robert listened, truly listened, for the first time in years, he began to see the cracks in his leadership. He acknowledged the mistakes he had made, both in his professional and personal life, and resolved to repair the damage wherever he could. Meanwhile, his efforts to save Manning Enterprises were beginning to gain traction. With the help of the consultants he had reluctantly hired, Robert spearheaded a campaign to rebuild the company's image and diversify its investments. Though progress was slow, the team's morale began to improve, bolstered by Robert's newfound humility and willingness to collaborate. For the first time in years, there was a sense of cautious optimism among the staff. Eleanor's consulting firm reached a new milestone with the launch of a major initiative aimed at empowering women entrepreneurs. The program, funded in part by Jonathan's Foundation, provided mentorship, resources, and funding to women from underserved communities. The launch event was a resounding success, drawing attention from media outlets and sparking conversations about the importance of inclusive leadership. At the heart of the event was Eleanor's keynote address, a moving speech that highlighted her own journey of resilience and reinvention. "Success isn't about perfection," she told the crowd. "It's about progress. It's about showing up, even when the odds are against you, and finding strength in the face of adversity." Her words resonated deeply, earning her a standing ovation and cementing her status as a role model for others. After the event, Eleanor found a quiet moment to reflect. She thought about the path that had brought her here, the challenges she had faced, the lessons she had learned, and the people who had supported her along the way. She realized that her greatest achievement wasn't the success of her firm or the recognition she had gained. It was the sense of purpose and fulfillment she had found in helping others succeed. One morning, Robert arrived at the office to find an envelope waiting for him on his desk. Inside was a letter from the board of directors, informing him that they would be conducting a vote of confidence in his leadership. The message was clear: despite his recent efforts, the board's trust in him remained tenuous. Robert's first instinct was to react with anger, but he quickly realized that this was an opportunity, a chance to demonstrate the changes he had made. At the meeting, Robert addressed the board with a candor that surprised even himself. He acknowledged the mistakes he had made, both in the company's strategy and in his leadership style. "I won't pretend that I've been perfect," he said. "But I am committed to learning from my failures and leading this company with integrity. I hope you'll give me the chance to prove that I can." His honesty resonated with the board, and though the vote was close, Robert retained his position as CEO. The experience marked a turning point for Robert. He realized that regaining the trust of others wouldn't happen overnight. It would require consistent effort, humility, and a willingness to accept accountability. But for the first time in years, he felt ready to face the challenges ahead, no matter how daunting they might be. Several months later, Eleanor received an unexpected email. It was from one of the directors at Manning Enterprises, inviting her to speak at a leadership retreat hosted by the company. The request surprised her. She hadn't expected her work to intersect with Robert's world again. After some consideration, she decided to accept. The opportunity to share her insights with a wider audience was too valuable to pass up, and she was curious to see how Robert's company had evolved since their last encounter. On the day of the retreat, Eleanor arrived at the venue, a picturesque estate surrounded by lush gardens. She was greeted warmly by the staff, many of whom recognized her from her recent media appearances. As she prepared for her session, Eleanor couldn't help but wonder how Robert would react to her presence. She reminded herself that her purpose was to share her expertise, not to revisit old wounds. When it was time for her presentation, Eleanor stepped onto the stage with her usual poise. She spoke about the importance of adaptive leadership, emphasizing the value of listening, collaboration, and continuous growth. The audience was captivated, their attention unwavering as she shared anecdotes and practical strategies. Among them was Robert, who sat in the back of the room, taking in her words with a mix of admiration and regret. After the session, Robert approached Eleanor as she was gathering her notes. "Eleanor," he said hesitantly, "that was incredible. You've built something truly remarkable." His sincerity caught her off guard, but she nodded politely. "Thank you, Robert," she replied. "It's been a journey, but one I wouldn't trade for anything." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared history hanging between them. Finally, Robert spoke again. "I don't deserve your forgiveness," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "But I hope you can believe that I've changed, or at least that I'm trying to." Eleanor regarded him thoughtfully, searching for traces of the man she had once known. "Change is never easy," she said. "But if you're willing to put in the work, it's always worth it." Her words were a balm, a quiet acknowledgement of his efforts without erasing the pain of the past. As Robert watched her leave, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years: hope. Robert left the retreat with Eleanor's words echoing in his mind. "If you're willing to put in the work, it's always worth it." He had spent years avoiding accountability, convinced that his wealth and status could shield him from the consequences of his actions. But now, for the first time, he felt compelled to confront the man he had been, not just to Eleanor but to others he had wronged along the way. He started by reaching out to former colleagues and friends, acknowledging the ways he had let them down. Some responded with surprise, others with skepticism, but a few expressed gratitude for his newfound self-awareness. It was a humbling process, one that forced Robert to see himself through the eyes of those he had dismissed or hurt. Each conversation chipped away at the walls he had built around himself, revealing a vulnerability he had long suppressed. One evening, Robert sat alone in his penthouse, sifting through old photographs and mementos. Among them was a wedding photo of him and Eleanor, their smiles bright with the promise of a future they had never fully realized. For the first time, Robert allowed himself to grieve, not for the loss of their marriage but for the man he had been during it. He realized that his inability to value Eleanor's quiet strength and authenticity had cost him not just their relationship but also a chance at true happiness. Eleanor's life, meanwhile, continued to expand in ways she hadn't imagined. Her leadership retreat presentation had sparked interest from several major corporations, leading to invitations for consulting partnerships and speaking engagements. Each new opportunity reinforced her belief that her work had the power to create meaningful change, not just for businesses but for the communities they served. At home, Eleanor and Jonathan were thriving as partners in both life and work. Their shared commitment to philanthropy had deepened their bond, and they often collaborated on initiatives that combined their expertise. Jonathan's steadfast support gave Eleanor the freedom to dream bigger, and together, they began planning a global summit on social impact, a bold endeavor that aimed to bring together leaders from various sectors to address pressing challenges. One evening, as they sat on their terrace overlooking the city, Eleanor reflected on how much her life had changed since the days of her marriage to Robert. "I never thought I'd be here," she admitted, her voice tinged with wonder. Jonathan smiled, taking her hand. "You're here because you earned it," he said. "Every step of the way, you've shown what it means to rise above." His words reminded Eleanor of the strength she had found within herself and the community she had built around her. At Manning Enterprises, Robert faced one of the most critical decisions of his career. A major investor had proposed a deal that promised significant financial gain but came with ethical concerns. In the past, Robert might have prioritized profit without hesitation, dismissing any objections as irrelevant. But now, he found himself grappling with the implications of the decision, not just for the company but for its employees and stakeholders. He called a meeting with his leadership team, inviting open discussion about the proposal. To his surprise, the conversation was lively and constructive, with team members voicing concerns and brainstorming alternatives. Robert listened intently, valuing their input in a way he hadn't before. When the meeting concluded, he made his decision: the company would reject the deal and focus on building sustainable, ethical partnerships. The move was risky, but it paid off. The decision earned Manning Enterprises renewed respect in the industry and reinvigorated the team's commitment to the company's mission. For Robert, it was a powerful reminder of the value of collaboration and integrity, lessons he had learned through the hard-earned process of self-reflection. One afternoon, Eleanor was attending a charity auction when she noticed Robert across the room. He was engaged in conversation with a group of young professionals, his demeanor noticeably more subdued than she remembered. Curious, she watched as he listened attentively, nodding and offering measured responses. There was a humility in his posture that caught her off guard. Later, as the event wound down, Robert approached her. "Eleanor," he began, his voice steady but softer than before, "I wanted to thank you for coming to the retreat. Your insights, they've stayed with me. They've changed how I think about leadership and about myself." Eleanor studied him, searching for signs of the man she had once known. What she saw was someone who had been tempered by failure and had emerged with a deeper understanding of his flaws. "You seem different," she said finally. "It's good to see you've found a way forward." Robert nodded, his expression earnest. "I still have a long way to go," he admitted. "But I'm trying." The conversation was brief but significant, a quiet acknowledgement of the growth they had both experienced since their paths had diverged. Weeks later, Eleanor received an envelope in the mail. Inside was a handwritten letter from Robert. It was a rare gesture, one that immediately piqued her curiosity. As she unfolded the paper, she saw the familiar slant of his handwriting, though the words themselves were unlike anything he had written before. "Eleanor," the letter began, "I've spent a lot of time thinking about the person I was and the ways I failed you. I realize now that I didn't just lose a marriage, I lost the chance to truly know and appreciate someone extraordinary. You taught me what it means to lead with grace and to live with purpose, even if I was too blind to see it at the time. I'm not writing this to seek forgiveness but to express my gratitude. Your strength inspired me to become a better man, and for that, I will always be thankful." Eleanor folded the letter carefully, her heart heavy with a mix of emotions. It wasn't an apology she needed, but it was one she appreciated. Robert's journey of self-awareness, though long overdue, was a testament to the power of reflection and growth. She placed the letter in a drawer, knowing it marked the closing of one chapter and the continuation of another. For Robert, writing the letter to Eleanor felt like a final step in acknowledging his past. Though he had no illusions about rekindling any relationship with her, the act of putting his thoughts into words gave him clarity and closure. He began to focus more intently on his work at Manning Enterprises, applying the lessons he had learned from his mistakes. Under his leadership, the company underwent a transformation, becoming more inclusive and collaborative. The changes were slow but deliberate, earning the company renewed respect and stability. At the same time, Robert pursued personal growth. He began volunteering at a non-profit organization that supported young entrepreneurs from underprivileged backgrounds. Working alongside people who were just starting their journeys reminded him of the passion and determination he had once felt but had lost along the way. It was humbling to see these young individuals tackle challenges with hope and resilience, qualities he had come to admire deeply. One evening, as he reviewed his notes from a mentoring session, Robert felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. He realized that his life no longer revolved around proving himself to others. For the first time in years, he was content to contribute without seeking recognition. In helping others, Robert found a renewed sense of purpose, one that didn't depend on accolades or power. Eleanor's Global Summit on Social Impact was the culmination of months of planning and collaboration. The event brought together leaders from diverse fields, each committed to addressing pressing societal challenges. Held in an expansive convention center, the summit featured keynote speeches, panel discussions, and workshops, all aimed at fostering innovative solutions to global issues. On the final day of the summit, Eleanor delivered a speech that captured the essence of the event. "True leadership," she said, her voice steady and resonant, "is not about commanding others but about empowering them. It's about creating spaces where people can thrive, not despite their challenges but because of them." Her words drew a standing ovation, the audience moved by her sincerity and vision. As the summit concluded, Eleanor felt a profound sense of accomplishment. She had built something far greater than a successful business. She had created a platform for change, one that would leave a lasting impact on countless lives. Jonathan, ever her greatest supporter, stood beside her, his pride evident. "You've built a legacy," he told her, his voice filled with admiration. Eleanor smiled, knowing that the journey she had taken was as meaningful as the destination she had reached. Months after the summit, Eleanor and Robert crossed paths once more, this time at a community event supporting young entrepreneurs. It was a casual gathering, far removed from the glittering galas and high-profile conferences they had previously attended. Robert was there as a mentor, sharing his insights with participants, while Eleanor had been invited as a guest speaker. When their eyes met across the room, both hesitated for a moment before approaching each other. "Eleanor," Robert said, his voice carrying a warmth that hadn't been there before. "I didn't expect to see you here." Eleanor smiled. "I could say the same. It's good to see you getting involved in something meaningful." They spent a few minutes catching up, the conversation flowing easily despite their history. Robert spoke about the joy he found in mentoring, while Eleanor shared updates on her recent projects. For the first time, their interaction felt free of the tension and regrets that had once defined their relationship. They weren't adversaries or former spouses, they were two people who had grown and found peace in their own ways. As the event ended, Robert extended his hand. "Thank you for everything, Eleanor," he said earnestly. "You've been a part of my journey in ways I'm only beginning to understand." Eleanor shook his hand, her smile genuine. "We all have our paths to walk, Robert. I'm glad you've found yours." That night, Eleanor reflected on her encounter with Robert. She realized that the resentment she had once felt toward him had been replaced by something softer, a quiet understanding of how people could change, given the chance. She no longer saw him as the man who had belittled her, but as someone who had taken responsibility for his mistakes and worked to become better. For Robert, the meeting was equally significant. It was a reminder of how far he had come and how much he had yet to learn. He felt a deep gratitude for the opportunities he had been given to grow and for the people, like Eleanor, who had helped him along the way. Their shared history, once a source of pain, now felt like a stepping stone toward the lives they had built. Years later, Eleanor and Robert's lives remained intertwined in small but meaningful ways. They occasionally crossed paths at events, exchanging kind words and updates on their respective endeavors. Eleanor's consulting firm continued to thrive, expanding its reach and impact, while Robert's work as a mentor brought him a sense of fulfillment he had never experienced in his corporate career. Eleanor stood on the balcony of her home one evening, watching the sun set over the city. Jonathan joined her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "Do you ever think about the past?" he asked. Eleanor nodded, her gaze thoughtful. "Sometimes," she admitted. "But only to remind myself of how far I've come and how grateful I am for where I am now." Meanwhile, in a modest office downtown, Robert finished a mentoring session with a young entrepreneur. As he packed up his things, he glanced at a small photograph on his desk, an image of the staff from Manning Enterprises, taken shortly before his retirement. It was a symbol of his journey, a reminder of the lessons he had learned and the life he had rebuilt. With a satisfied sigh, Robert turned off the lights and stepped out into the evening, ready to embrace whatever lay ahead.